All right, guys, so we're back with another episode of Read Episode 10, Chapter 4, or Part 4. Really quickly, I completely forgot to mention this. I am that excited to read this chapter. I will try to find out about the pictures of the accident. I will try to find out about getting some pictures of John Taylor. I'm not going to try and find pictures of this person that's on Reddit telling the story because I don't really want to do that, but I will try to actually find if these are real. Again, it's claiming that everything on Reddit No Sleep is true, but again, obviously we all have our beliefs of whether or not that is a fact or just something stated by Reddit. And in my opinion, as you guys have heard in the past with other stories, I don't believe everything I hear. Just to clarify, so oh my God, I cannot tell you guys how excited I am to read this, so I'm just going to cut straight to the chase and get into it. I have a recorder. I won't claim I didn't panic because I did. It was a quick flash all over my body, like I was suddenly falling. I wanted at the same time to throw up and to run a marathon, but wasn't able to move. A few seconds later, the feeling subsided, leaving me with a fast-beating heart. The cell still glued to my ear. I put it on the desk and shook my hands violently, as if getting ready for some exercise. I paced the room instead, back and forth, from the door back to the desk, shooting glances at the phone. Calling back would be risky. Calling the cops would mean terminating this whole sting operation I thought I had going on. The way she'd spoken, it was obvious Taylor was in the room with her. Meaning at the very least, he was aware of the call. If he wasn't the initiator. Which in turn meant Mary wasn't in too great a danger. So let me read that. Which in turn meant Mary wasn't in too great a danger. Unless he planned to present me with her dead body upon my next visit. But that sounded so much like a cheap horror film that I chuckled. Humorously. I turned off my phone and logged off of social media and the damned freelancer site. I made coffee and drank it almost in a gulp. I tried to eat but couldn't until late in the evening. I tried reading but found myself aimlessly scanning pages without any of the words registering in my mind. In the end, I spent the rest of the day browsing the web, constantly typing and then scrolling the same few pages I visited on a regular basis. Sometimes inaction was the best course of action. The only winning move is not to play, and so on. Understandably. And I was comfortable hiding behind the notion up until Tuesday morning. The previous night was sleepless, and I was tired, but the adrenaline must have kept me up. Because every time I thought about going back to that house, I couldn't sit still. Looking back at it, I felt the same way I had felt before an exam. Anxious, but energetic. I showered and dressed, and then went to pack my bag, and I had turned the phone on some days back. But there were no new calls or messages. Nothing new from Mary. Nothing new from Mary Taylor either. I didn't want to call her, so I texted, heading your way. As I was getting in the car downstairs, they replied, brilliant. An odd way to reply, I thought, which only made me more paranoid. But then again, I was on my way and trying to summon that determination and confidence I had just a few days earlier. The plan remained unchanged. Go in, talk to the man, and write down his stories, go home. Only this time, I had to get one-on-one with Mary as well. That would be the difficult part. It's playing past by, sorry guys. The rainy days had passed, and the sun was back in the sky, with the weekend promising to be in the high 90s. I imagined Mary sneaking another note under the wipers, and then I wished the weather had been this nice the last time. But none of that made me feel better about the upcoming visit. Back in the comfort of home, it had been easy to think myself some kind of hero, and of an undercover agent on a mission. But actually making myself drive in the direction of Tampa Palms was tough. I drove slowly, aiming to stop at as many reds as possible, and not getting enough. It ended up being too short a drive. I turned into the lot, but this time the gate didn't open for me. Perhaps that was a sign for me to finally turn around and abandon the idea. But instead, I stepped out of the car and came over to the buzzer to press the button. Nobody spoke. Even though there was some static coming from the box on the gate, it opened as I walked back to the car and I drove through slowly, playing out scenarios in my head. But all of those scenarios assumed Mary would be home. So when I didn't see her red Ford in the front of the house, I blinked. Had she ran out for some groceries? Had she ran off? Had Taylor killed her and dumped her car somewhere? I gripped the wheel tighter and focused on making my way to the house. No tactical parking this time. No pretense. I grabbed the bag and stepped out of the car. The front was not locked and opened just enough to give me the hint. I entered. The house was quiet, and as I closed the door, it seemed as if all the sound had been sucked out of it. I stood still and soon heard some noises coming from another room, which I thought was the kitchen. Food was being made. I got hopeful for a moment, ready to meet Mary and drag her aside to get things straight. Mr. Warner, just on time. Taylor. His voice was different somehow, more energetic, as if he'd received some good news before I stepped in. He walked out to meet me, wearing the same clothes, wheeling the IV stand next to him, just like before. But his face, too, was different, more animated, happier. He stretched out his hand, and I shook it. Afternoon, Mr. Taylor. I went in pretend mode, the way you do with some acquaintances, being nice but not too forthcoming. He was my boss, technically, not a friend. He is a fucking serial killer. I cleared my throat. Is this a good time? Perfect time, yes. Come in. I'm making food today. I went to the table and sat on the chair, the same chair I'd sat on previously. It was beginning to feel like my office, and that was at least some comfort. I got my notebook out, opening it on the page with the timeline, and said, as if just to say something, will Mary be joining us? When I raised my eyes, Taylor was standing on the other side of the table looking at me, one of his hands on the back of his chair, the other around the IV stand. I couldn't tell whether his grip was extremely tight or his skin was naturally pale. After a pause, he said, she might. There was a problem with your child again. And then, jolly again, he sat down. But let's not talk about the sad things in life. Tell me, where did we last stop? Where did we stop last time? Topeka, as I recall. I pretended to look through my notes. Topeka, yes, until 1995. Correct. How was that time for you, apart from that kid's murder? I said this lightly without even thinking. Taylor glared at me, his smile gone. Are you implying something, young man? Then relaxed. I must have spoken with you, Mr. Warner. I apologize. Sorry, I must have spooked you, Mr. Warner. I apologize. I forced the pen in my hand not to shake. That wasn't what I meant, but wasn't it? I meant, I understand. All these stories have a certain impact, a stamp on my young years. My morbid fascination I have with them, I suppose, comes from the lack of anything else of substance. These are sadly the things I remember most. He looked down and away, a sad old man, who made a part of me pity his loneliness. It must be hard to look back at your childhood and remember only death. But another part of me saw through it. Something was off here. He'd been all this time. Something was off here. Had been all this time. Taylor was changing his tactic. He knew he'd been driving me nuts, and now he wanted me back on his side. Tranquil and oblivious, I couldn't hold back a tiny grin. I'm sorry, I said. I put a more serious impression for him. I'm sorry, I said, and I put on a more serious impression for him. How about we go over some positive stuff then? Where'd you go after Topeka? Flawless victory. Taylor smiled again, looking up at me, ready to jump in his next story. He said, Madison, Wisconsin. My new dad, Mrs. Sloan. That's what he demanded I called him. Owned a business. As you remember, he had a moving company. And there was a lot to move in Wisconsin because there were farms and factories and everything you can imagine. And all of it needed to be transported all across the US of A. So in 1955, all our things were loaded into one of his company's trucks, and we spent the day on the road on our way to Madison in Mrs. Sloan's Chevrolet wagon. Must have been some trip back in those days, I noted, making sure to Google that later, just for fun. It was. That wagon served me until the late 60s. A fine ride. I didn't hear that part. Hung up on the way Taylor said served me. It served him, but not Mr. Sloan. I made a note to look deeper into Thomas Sloan and the circumstances of his death. Anyway, so pretty soon I had to find a job, you see. Mr. Warner, are you with me? Yes, I'm sorry. I just got a little carried away with those notes, making sure I got everything down. Please continue. Well, like I said, I found a job at a farm. Oh, excuse me a minute. Something was hissing in the kitchen, boiling water splashing on the stove. Taylor hurried, to the best of his abilities, dragging the stand next to him, his wheels squealing. 1955, Madison, Wisconsin. Worked on a farm. I scribbled down. The story sounded boring already, but it was better than another suspicious murder. I figured at this point I needed a break from the scary stuff. I'd smelled something tasty cooking. And when Taylor returned a few minutes later, I told him as much. He said, an old recipe, scrambled eggs with ham and tomatoes. I didn't wonder why it was taking so long. I should have. Very well, I said. So a farm. Yes, he said, sitting down. Yes, he said, sitting down. A farm. There were plenty of those around Madison, and there was always something to do. I, for one, shoveled cow shit around, he crackled. I was a young man myself, too dumb for any important task, but strong enough to make sure cows had clean stalls. Must have sucked, I said. Attempting to connect with the teenage John Taylor, channeling my own teenage self, whose whose dirty job had been delivering trays from tables to the trash can at a local McD's. It sucked all right, but I quickly moved up the ladder, if you can call it that. The family who owned the farm, the Jeffersons, who worked directly with a local milkman, Jerry Wiggles. There used to be a TV show called The Wiggles. I don't, sorry, I have to say that, I'm sorry. I don't suppose you remember the time when those fellows were around. Mr. Wiggles would drive over to the farm, pick up crates of fresh milk, and drive it all around town. Regular for adults, strawberry and chocolate for the kids. Oh my God, that sounds so good though. The kids loved strawberry, and so they did. That really didn't make it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. I don't know. Like I would have understood the kids loved it just by saying the kids loved strawberry, period, and whatever. And every other day in the evening, Mr. Wiggles would repeat the route, picking up empty bottles and bringing them over to the farm, where Miss Jefferson would wash them. So the process could repeat the next day. One day, the milkman's truck broke down, and my new dad, Mr. Sloan, lent him a newer model. Right, I said to stay awake. See, it wasn't meant to be. Soon I was assisting Mr. Wiggles on his route, moving the milk crates back and forth, collecting bottles and so forth. In a few years, I would be driving that truck, or at least that was how far my ambitions went at the time. There was something sinister about that last part, almost as if there was some subtext only Taylor knew about. Something hissed again, and Taylor once again left me alone at the table. I looked through my notes. There was a lot of ways this could be complete bullshit. Yet, at the same time, it sounded boring enough to simply be true. I made a few marks next to the part I planned to verify later. There were a lot of names and locations attached, so that wouldn't be a problem. When Taylor returned, he carried a tray with 2 plates and 2 cups on it. Excuse me. Holding it with just one hand. He sat down on the table. Coffee with milk? I guessed right. He genuinely seemed like a nice guy and a welcoming host at the moment, and I played along. Delicious. But I'd seen Hannibal, okay? I know it's dramatic and silly, but I wasn't going to eat any meat he offered me. But I did eat the eggs, and I did drink the coffee. Albeit, it was too milky for my taste. Milk is going to taste like milk. Maybe a little thicker, maybe a little bit more running, but it's milk. A little bit. I guess there's too much milk is what he's trying to say rather than coffee. I don't know. Taylor wouldn't poison me. Not now. When he thought I was back under his spell. This is really good, Mr. Taylor. Thank you. Sorry about the ham. I'm a vegetarian. I lied. Convincingly enough. Taylor smirked. No wonder you're so thin. Okay, that's nice. As he finished his meal, I tried not to imagine him cutting Mary open, the way they had in the TV show, and found it rather easy. Some of these horrors can drive you crazy when you're alone at night, but sitting there at the dinner table, having a normal meal and a normal conversation, I felt normal. Maybe Taylor did have me under his spell after all. He set his plate aside and said, "So, the milkman job, yes?" We made our rounds every day. Mr. Wiggles would drive and I would do the legwork. This is where the story gets interesting. One evening, we were picking up empty bottles and stopped at the smallest house. A big family, 7 kids. The oldest, Tammy, walked out to meet me. She said the strawberry milk tasted funny, and that they had drunk only half of it, and only because it was their favorite. I listened to her, but didn't say anything because that was up to the Jeffersons to resolve. And when I told Mr. Wiggles, he just told me to pick whatever they had and get out of there before the girl's parents came out to complain. There was something fishy. Sorry, some fishy bullshit again. I'm not even going to lie. I very, very quickly caught on to what he means. I glanced at my cup of coffee, and the taste of milk in my mouth suddenly became unbearable. But Taylor continued, so I put their half-empty crate of milk in the back. And Mr. Wiggles said he would take the rest home, because his kids like strawberry best, as well, which I had no objections to. I didn't care, but the next morning he didn't show up at our house to pick me up. And I had to make my own way to the farm, only to find it closed, no sign of people. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I swallowed. So did she. Just kidding, that's really, no. The eggs and coffee had mixed into something terrible into my stomach, and I expected the rest of Taylor's story to only make things worse. His voice was hypnotizing, and it was getting more and more intense as he was nearing the end of the story. What happened? Sorry, where the heck? Sorry, what happened? I asked. I walked the farm around, but the Jeffersons weren't there. I went to the warehouse where they made chocolate milk, but it was closed. And as it wouldn't be running for another few hours. But the strawberry warehouse was too loud, so I went there next. What I saw there, I still can't forget. I felt sick. Excuse me, sir, can I use the bathroom? A little surprised, he said. Down the hall and left, past the kitchen. I barely recall how I got there. One moment I was getting up from the table. The next, I was kneeling to the toilet, ridding myself of Taylor's welcoming meal. It was embarrassing, and I hoped he hadn't heard me. But then, as I wiped my face and eyes, I saw something on the floor, between the toilet and the wall. There was fresh blood. Oh my God. I am so tempted to read part 5 right now, but I'm going to save that for another episode. For another video, because this video is getting just under 23 minutes. It's now 23 minutes roughly. So I'm going to wrap this up. And until next time, guys, thank you so much for listening. I really, I've said this so many times, really can't wait to get to the next chapter. Oh my gosh. I really hope that there is a chapter 6. I haven't read chapter 5, so I don't really know if maybe he ends up finding out and then that's the end of the series. But we'll find out soon enough. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, thanks for listening. Have a great one.